So what are design patterns? According to Wikipedia, in software engineering, a software design pattern is a general, reusable solution to a commonly occurring problem within a given context. It's not a finished design that can be transformed directly into source or machine code. Rather, it's a description or template for how to solve a problem that can be used in many different situations. As security practitioners, we should think of design patterns as formalized practices that we can use to mature the governance of an application or system. If maturity is our objective, we can rank those design patterns by the desired maturity objectives, the level of automation and effort that's required to implement and maintain those design patterns, and determine what situations a given design pattern might apply to. So let's jump into the design patterns. Design pattern number 7, manage by exception. And I'm not a fan of this design pattern, but it's a reality for it probably anecdotally the most common design pattern that security organizations use. This is where the drift or deviation from policies is usually discovered when there is some sort of audit or some sort of review or an accidental discovery, or in the worst case, an incident. This design pattern doesn't involve much effort. In fact, some of that effort is intentional, where the policies sit on a shelf, no additional investment until some event happens that highlights the drift or deviation from your policies. Some small security teams see this as a way to stretch their limited security investment. Drift, once found, would then just be entered into the risk register if it's too large to be automatically fixed. My personal opinion is this is really a false economy. It's true that some exceptions might take years to discover or actually never be discovered, but once found, there might be so much drift that it takes an exceptional amount of time, resources, and money to clean up that particular drift. Not to mention any particular costs or fines if an incident is part of that drift discussion. A second issue with this design pattern is really the potential for crisis of confidence. Your execs do invest something in the security program. You may not think it's enough, but they certainly invest in the security program, and they expect some sort of return for that. Now imagine from their perspective that each time there's some kind of audit or review, there's a whole set of standards and policies that have drifted very far away from the expectation. And that's being reported by an independent third party up to either the executive team or the board, depending on your organization. Executives might begin to wonder about the value of their investment, and if we're really, as senior security practitioners, beginning to really able to stay on top of the security program. Policies are just really one part of governance. So if you want to get resources as either a CISO or some other senior cybersecurity leader, you're going to want to be able to demonstrate to your executive team that you understand your program and that you're on top of these issues and working to get in front of any sort of drift and actually are working towards reducing the amount of risk that you have within your organization. That way you'll avoid having a crisis of confidence. Design pattern number 6, manual reviews. This is probably just as popular anecdotally as is the previous design pattern of managing by exception. Manual reviews are having to determine if a system or application is out of standard or has drifted from standards by manually accessing the system and looking at the state and configuration of its settings. So this really is a very popular way. We do this quarterly. We do this, monthly, and if we need to, for instance, review the firewall because we have some compliance requirement to do that, we'll normally send an engineer out to perform that manual review or to check the email configuration, those sorts of things. Also, if a machine is compromised, a lot of times we'll physically or remotely enter that machine and then run commands searching for or reviewing remote connections or processes or other forensic evidence for anything that might look suspicious. What makes this design pattern so popular is it's really easy to plan, track, and measure the frequency with which these reviews are completed. And also, there may be some legacy systems, for instance, that simply don't have the ability to be automated in a way that makes sense for your organization. And so this may be the only way that you could detect drift on those legacy systems. The downside of this design pattern is really that it doesn't scale very well. So, how many enterprise applications and systems do you have within your inventory? You can sample some of them, you can look at some other ones, but there's probably a large amount of those that are never going to get reviewed in any way. And if they are, it takes not just a large amount of time, but likely also specific expertise to perform the review. You're probably not going to have your intern be able to go and perform a thorough manual review of a mission critical system, nor do I think you want that to happen. So there's some level of expertise that's required. And then, even on the best days, the best engineers might miss something. They didn't click on a configuration menu or something else. They believe that they have performed a thorough review, and unintentionally they've missed the one thing that is out of compliance or is reflective of standards drift. So again, this is a popular design pattern, but it's not necessarily the best because it doesn't necessarily scale. It requires a lot of expertise, and there's just the simple probability that eventually you're going to miss something important. Design pattern number 5, raw data correlation. I promise you that all of us, every single organization has some aspect of this design pattern governing their controls today, regardless of their state of maturity. This design pattern requires a human to manually look through data related to the state of a system, application, or user and that data has been generally moved to a known place off the system or otherwise generated in an automated way. You'll have to manually search through that data in order to find instances of standards drift. This human review of raw data can come in multiple forms and be present in millions of ways throughout your organization. It could be something as simple as an employee who every morning has to look through an email inbox that has a number of alerts, hundreds if not thousands of alerts from the night before, to determine if something has somehow drifted out of policy and needs some sort of response. It could be, the raw analysis of log data and searching through that log data, looking for instances of compromise or threats or doing research to determine if something was put in that raw data that is indicative of a system or application or user that has somehow drifted from standards. It also could be looking at the results of the scans from your application security tools to determine which are false positives and which are not false positives. It also could be looking through forensic data or using a tool like OS Query to make manual searches about the states of your systems and applications, especially across multiple systems. The downside of this design pattern is even if the data is generated in an automated way, you're still using a manual process in order to make the determination of whether or not things are within standard or not. This requires a large amount of effort, and even data in an automated way that's generated in an automated way might require some level of tribal knowledge in order to be able to ascertain. So you could bring in a new engineer who has a high level of technical knowledge, and yet there's still that tribal knowledge that's required about your particular systems so that they might not understand if something is or is not indicative of an issue that needs to be fixed. They may also need to know how or where to search for these documents and may have to repeat these on a regular basis in order to get the level of coverage that you need to understand if there's to get the coverage and frequency that you need in order to detect standards drift in a particular system. And then the amount of information seems to be ever growing, especially as we do partial automations throughout our infrastructure. So as I mentioned, all of us have this, and we've all seen incidents in which the root cause was reported in some way and exists in some large pool of data, but either that data was not reviewed, it was missed, or it was otherwise ignored. The bad actors take advantage of the downsides of this particular design principle. So, just a side tip, try to if this is a requirement that you have, try to outsource as much of this as you can so that what comes back to you is actually the process data without your team having to spend a large amount of time doing that raw data correlation. Design pattern number 4, compiled analysis. This is what you traditionally think about when you think about, metrics and KPIs and KRIs. They can be structured in a way that can help you actually identify when there are issues with standards drift in your organization. And the inputs from this can range from fully automated to fully manual. I'd also include dashboards in this particular design pattern. If our metrics are answering the right questions, you can quickly be pointed to potential areas where your controls are broken, non-existent, or you've experienced significant standards drift. For instance, in my particular organization, we calculate and track our patching risk score. And our patching risk score answers a set of key questions for us that tells us if there are issues with controls or issues with our process. So the types of questions that our metrics answer, for instance, is our patching frequency correct? If it's not correct, you're going to see a steady rise of that particular patching risk score despite the best efforts of our patching teams. Where is the majority of our patching risk, and have we prioritized the right set of patches? Are there new patches out that carry an extremely high amount of risk, and a number of machines within our infrastructure remain unpatched? And is our patching tool working as expected? We were able to actually find an issue in our particular controls in which our patches were timing out because of a configuration setting. But we didn't find that because of an actual review of the settings initially. We found that, or suspected that something was broken, because we knew that our patching frequency was sufficient, but we weren't seeing a regular decrease in some of our areas. And that led to an investigation, which then revealed that we had some broken deployment configurations. and those were fixed. And now we watch that score, tumble in the weeks following that particular discovery. They also answer the questions for us if we see significant new machines. So, all else being equal, our score should rise and fall on a fairly predictable rate. But if new machines are introduced all of a sudden, now we may see a rise that we otherwise can't explain in our patching risk score metrics. Of course, the only real downside of this particular design pattern is, you can waste a lot of expensive time measuring the wrong things. So you have to make sure that your metrics actually answer interesting questions. And then make sure that they're focused, those questions are focused on, are the right controls in place? Are they working as expected? And are we seeing the expected behavior from these particular controls, or as the output of these particular controls? The other issue is simply that sometimes some business processes or other things can only be measured manually. So rather than taking 20 minutes in an automated way to generate these dashboards, you may have to do stubby pencil these things in order to figure out what the outcome is and be able to generate the metrics that are of interest. Design pattern number 3, automated detection. These are really automated reviews or monitoring of systems that look for drift with, high fidelity tuned alerts, so that you don't have to spend a lot of manual time determining if something is within policy or outside of policy, or if there's drift in a particular system. You can think of these as, the most common ways to look at these are, SIM tools and internal automation that can help a team scale and also cover a variety of systems with single people. It also removes some of the expertise that's required by building that expert knowledge into the automation itself. You may be wondering what the difference is between this particular design pattern and the raw data correlation design pattern. Ingesting data into an automated system doesn't always create an output of high fidelity alerts. If you're determining in manual ways whether or not there's standards drift, that's probably not the automated detection or the best use or the best application of the automated detection design pattern. And you're probably not using it. You're probably using the raw data correlation. You might apply this particular design pattern in a million different ways. You could have, for instance, a high fidelity alert that says a user's been added to the domain admin or local administrator group. You might have a situation where you want to alert on successful authentications via username and password, but failed MFA authentications, because perhaps that's an indicator that the authorized credentials had been stolen in some way, but the bad actor did not have access to the secondary form of authentication. You might also use this, for instance, if to determine that the owner of a particular endpoint process is an administrator of some form, and that process is making a remote connection out to some foreign country or outside of the network, outside of what your policy dictates. I like this design pattern because this design pattern scales well. There's still the issue with having to remediate in a manual way, but you do get 24/7 coverage, or potentially 24/7 coverage with this particular design pattern, if you have ongoing automation that can be supported. Sometimes this particular design pattern doesn't apply or doesn't work because of the nature of legacy systems. A downside to this design pattern is it usually requires some sort of investment in either a tool or custom automation. And if it's custom automation, that custom automation is not only going to be needed to be created with the expertise, the expert knowledge built into the business rules of that automation, but it's also going to need to be maintained. And automation that's not maintained gets more and more ineffective over time. Design pattern number 2 is self-healing. This is one of my favorite design patterns because it's full automation. And what separates this from previous design patterns is not only do you have the element of automated detection, but you also have automated enforcement, which is an action that takes place which brings that standards drift back into within your policy. You see this a lot. Good examples of this would be your antivirus, for instance. A file comes in, it's outside of what's allowed on your system, and there's automated enforcement action that takes place. Same with data loss prevention tools. Someone is trying to move a file, a sensitive document of some sort, to some area that they're not supposed to move this, then some action takes place which blocks the user from having to do this. So things never get too far out of enforcement, or excuse me, out of standards before the enforcement action takes place. The downside, of course, is that self-healing may not be available for all systems. And there's likely a process that you'll need to go through to inform and train users so they don't take actions which would drift from standards and require that enforcement action to take place. That way, at least they understand why they've gently been brought back into a place that meets your policy. Design pattern number 1, and probably my favorite of all of them, is secure by default. And this design pattern is effective because essentially all of the security friction is abstracted away from the user, because the user simply can't perform tasks that are insecure or that cause drift from standards. They can do multiple things in the best cases, but those guardrails keep them within policy at all times, and the permissions that have been applied do not allow them to get out of policy in any way. A great example of this is an ATM machine. With an ATM machine, users can perform multiple functions, but they're never really going to be able to do serious damage to their own accounts, and they'll never put the bank seriously at risk. The bank won't ever be robbed directly through the ATM machine, and if it is, there's only a fixed amount of risk to the bank as a result of that. This is a great situation and a great design pattern for a cyber team. Some examples of these might be, using GPOs, group policy objects, so that Windows users can't auto-run USBs if they were to put one of those into a USB port, or disabling macros on files that they bring in from external sources. Conditional access rules might be another good example of this, in which users are provided a set of access privileges that are in line with where they're logging from, what sort are they on a corporate machine, not on a corporate machine, and it shapes their permissions in the background in a way that there's only a fixed amount of risk to the organization that has defined these. Conditional access also lets us perform actions that help to shape that environment as well. For instance, dynamic multi-factor authentication might be required when a user wants to access a sensitive file, just so the organization can be sure that this is the actual user that is represented by that request. This design pattern works really well in cloud or virtualized environments, but it's somewhat difficult to put into other environments. So it takes a great deal of planning to be successful at spinning up secure by design environments. And we need to work with the business units so that we understand all of their needs, such that when a user is in such an environment, they actually can do all of the things that they need to do, but can't do anything that puts the organization beyond a known fixed amount of low risk. This design principle also requires an investment in automation and maintenance of that automation. And that's something you're going to have to plan for and gain agreement with from your executive team. Hopefully this video has helped you as a senior security practitioner to understand that there are design patterns that you can apply to help you to detect drift in your standards, and also leverage those design patterns to provide a common language and measurement so that you can have discussions with your executive team around controls governance. You can follow me in a variety of places. On YouTube, you can follow me by subscribing and ringing the bell. On Twitter, search for Opinionated Security and follow me there. Or on the Medium blog platform, where I publish articles on a regular basis that help senior security practitioners to understand their program and have conversations with their executives around various topics. Thank you.